It's Tuesday, the 10th December 2024. Let's take a look at the headlines making wave in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper, the leading story. ACF, Atiku, others lampoon presidency over 2027 poll. You can read that on page 2 of the newspaper. And above the leading story by the left, 3,270 Nigerians gain American citizenship via military service, says US. You can read that on page 13 of the newspaper. Keyamo FCCPC differs on airpeace probe. You can read that on page 21 of the newspaper. Tax reform. National Assembly caucus meeting delays. Talks with AGF. You can read that on page 2 of the newspaper. Nigerians' debt profile burden for current next generation, says Obasanjo. You can read that on page 30 of the newspaper. And below the leading story by the left, Yuletide Southeast South airfare jumped to 287,800. You can read that on page 21 of the newspaper. Defamation. Farotimi gets 50 million naira bail to submit passports. You can read that on page 30 of the newspaper. Ajayi files suit to stop Ayedatiwa as Ondo governor. You can read that on page 28 of the newspaper. I'm moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. Mountain East-West triggers health crisis in children. You can read that on page 14 of the newspaper. And above the leading story by the left, alleged cybercrime. Court grants 50 million naira bail to Farotimi, seizes passport. You can read that on page 6 of the newspaper. Tax reform bills. Southeast Senate caucus settles for wider consultation. You can read that on page 9 of the newspaper. Anti-corruption war should begin from leadership, says Obasanjo. You can read that on page 10 of the newspaper. NBA laments closure of appeal courts in Awka, Enugu and Owerri. You can read that on page 11 of the newspaper. Party supporters clashes as Edo Governor Election Tribunal begins sitting. You can read that on page 12 of the newspaper. UBA's 239.4 billion naira rights issues excites stakeholders. You can read that on page 20 of the newspaper. Shocker. NFF retires 12 billion naira without paying players allowance bonuses. You can read that on page 38 of the newspaper. I'm moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust, the leading story. Southeast Senate caucus seeks wider consultations. You can read that on page 4 of the newspaper. I'm moving over to the next paper, Nigerian Tribune, the leading story. 2025 budget, MDA's risks zero allocation. You can read that on page 3 of the newspaper. And above the leading story by the left, Edo Gumba Tribunal receives 7 petitions adjourn sitting till December 18. You can read that on page 16 of the newspaper. Tax reforms bill. Southeast Senate seek wider consultations. You can read that on page 5 of the newspaper. Nigeria working with Niger Republic to crush Lakurawa, says Chief of Army Staff. You can read that on page 3 of the newspaper. And below the leading story by the left, Afe Babalola, Farotimi gets 50 million bail. You can read that on page 4 of the newspaper. Import license. Dangote Refinery seeks to amend suit against NNPCL. Others. You can read that on page 21 of the newspaper. New Port Harcourt Refinery is over 90% completed, says NNPCL. You can read that on page 7 of the newspaper. Tinubu's re-election will cheat North, says Atiku. You can read that on page 16 of the newspaper. Fight against corruption should begin from the top, says Obasanjo. You can read that on page 21 of the newspaper. And moving over to the next paper, Business Day. The leading story. Flights grounded over fuel line faults. And above the leading story by the left, what South Africa really wants out of G20. You can read that on page 2 of the newspaper. Telkom boss happy with fiber spending. You can read that on page 10 of the newspaper. Prod as number 1 in test championship. You can read that on page 16 of the newspaper. Call for McKinsey ban and blacklisting. Gumedo's vision fights back over sales of tongue guards. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper and read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.